Hello, everyone. I'm Ramon Robinson with ALA Editions, ALA Neal Schumann. I want to welcome everyone here to the fifth meeting of ADA Neal's Book Club, which is the ALA Editions, ALA Neal Schumann Book Club. We're so grateful to have Cate Carlyle, who is one of the co-authors of this month's book club selection, Your Passport to International Librarianship, and Anna Neatrour, a co-author of Our Very New Release, The High Impact Digital Library, Innovative Approaches for Outreach and Instruction. We expect that you'll learn quite a lot about international librarianship, digital librarianship, and some intersections between the two during this special author-to-author edition of the book club. So from here, I'll hand the virtual microphone over to Anna to introduce herself and ask her first of several questions of Cate before Cate does the same for her. Welcome, Anna and Cate.
Thank you. I'm Anna Neatrour. I'm head of digital library services at the University of Utah. And actually, I wanted to ask Cate to introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Cate Carlyle. I'm speaking today from Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm a librarian in the Faculty of Education Library at Mount St. Vincent University.
Thanks so much. So I think I'm going to just go ahead and start by asking Cate some questions about her book and international librarianship. And we'll just start with like a very basic one, which is what is international librarianship and who tends to do this work?
So Dee Win and I wrote this book, and we relied on J. Stephen Parker's definition of international librarianship, and that was from the 1970s and still is a standard definition for the term today. I'm just going to read that from my book for you if I can. It's just a few lines. He said that international librarianship consists of activities carried out among or between government or non-governmental institutions, groups, or individuals of two or more nations to promote, establish, develop, maintain, and evaluate library, documentation, and allied services, and librarianship and the library profession generally in any part of the world. So that's what we were working from. In terms of who conducts international librarianship, in our experience and what we're talking about in terms of mostly volunteer international librarianship, people would be list professionals at different stages in their career. They may be new graduates, they may be retired, they may be list students. Basically, anyone who has the means, the time, the employer support, if needed, to travel to these different areas to work with libraries.
Great, thank you so much. And I'd like next, if you can tell me how your interest and passions for travel and cultural immersion brought you to international librarianship.
Sure, I've always traveled from a young age with an immigrant parent, and I was working at another university here in Halifax. I knew the job, the patrons back to front, and was feeling a bit stagnant. And one day an email came in requesting volunteers for a group called Librarians Without Borders to help with emerging schools and libraries in Guatemala that needed assistance. And on that tour was also Dee Win. That was our first trip. I was curious. I followed up with the group that was created at that time at Western University in London, Ontario. And we went on that trip, other trips together and apart, and eventually ended up leading groups on that same trip.
Great. So in your book, you and your co-author describe people who are committed to volunteer work as among like sort of your top target audience. Would you say that being willing to volunteer is critical to making inroads in international librarianship?
It depends on what aspect you're thinking about in terms of international librarianship. As I said, our experience is with volunteering. That's our passion. We love to pay it forward. We're very service oriented. And we also put a lot financially and physically and of our time into doing it. So we were not looking to make a living. I would assume the easiest way to make a living in that way, it isn't really what we're talking about, but that would be the adventure tourism that happens a lot. I've heard of certain places in the United States where you basically go on a holiday, but they tie in building a school or doing something, a one-off. You're not really supporting them before and after the trip. But other than that, in terms of what we do in setting up, it's not the goal to make a living. I don't know if it's possible other than the travel and adventure tourism.
That makes sense. So keeping that in mind, like how can people who are already working as librarians find the space to do international librarianship work, either as volunteers or like maybe for some supplemental pay without it becoming like a total break from their current job or career?
Yes, they could do it like we did. We used research time or sabbatical in academic libraries. You have that time, you can tie it into your research. You could tie it into the faculty you're in, as I'm in the education library. Do some research, share it when you return, and create that ongoing relationship with the library you're working with to help them in the future. Some employers support that time away as a kind of professional development, and they'll give you that time. We used our vacation if we didn't have research time to do it. So volunteering is sacrificing. So it's not necessarily something that you make money or you're given the extra time. But in our case, we tried to find ways to make it work, and we discussed that in the book too.
That's great. So having this being like part of your work, how do you stay connected with international librarianship? Were you using like the internet and digital technology a lot in the 2010s? And do you think digital technology is more critical to international librarianship now, than it was, in the last decade or so?
So we have to mention the pandemic in the middle of this session. So online communication has always been crucial, pre-trip and post-trip, because you can't keep going back and forth. You're going the one time to help them or a few times. So you have to find out what needs are, find out what supplies are needed, what training needs are. And that's usually done through shared Google Docs and email, things like that, as well as the follow-up after the trip to make sure things are still working that you set up, and to gauge needs ongoing, as it's not a one-time relationship. So digital communication has always been important, and then obviously COVID shut down all of the trips, all of the travel. So that was the only option to help those libraries and help the staff. And since post the pandemic, people are just more comfortable with that means of communicating. Some of the libraries that we've been to didn't even have a computer until we went for the first time. So we set those up, we showed them how to use it, and then that created that digital connection going forward. Other things like collection building, even, we might do that in person and help them catalog and shelve, and kind of show them how to take a closed collection that is very small and very specific and turn it into a circulating collection. So you can do the cataloging and database work for libraries at a distance. So it's really helpful.
That's great. Wondering if you can give some examples of how international librarianship, as you practiced it, helped promote equitable access to information.
Sure. Some of the ways we would have the library or school library that we were going to visit send what they need. So they would send lists, titles, supplies, craft supplies, all of that, that we would bring. Print materials, as I mentioned, tablets and e-readers were donated, any supplies that they needed. So that enabled them to serve a larger group. It enabled them to take a closed collection to a circulating collection. We assisted staff with training as well as teachers, if it's a school librarian, with training. We talked about bias. We talked about how to purchase and because a lot of the staff aren't librarians, aren't trained librarians. We just gave them a little bit of training in what we do as librarians so they can do that to make the collection and the space equitable and open to all. We also weeded collections for some of these libraries because we found that very well-meaning groups would come to them and give them collections. It might be a church and all the collection is about a certain religion. So that's kind of where teaching them about bias comes in. So we would help make sure the collection was equitable as well to everyone.
Great, thank you. So also just speaking about sort of outreach and instruction, that's discussed a lot in your book. How important were those efforts to what you and your co-author considered as successful international librarianship efforts?
So Dee and I specifically are both former teachers. So outreach and instruction, we're very comfortable with. We've both worked in public libraries that do a lot of outreach. And it was especially necessary for the libraries that were emerging in community hubs or schools that we communicate with the community and show them what's available and do outreach to see what their needs are. We would also work with the teachers on library use. We'd work with library staff that they might have hired, and students and parents too. Some of the parents in the places we visited see reading as not something you do for pleasure. You read the Bible and that's it. So we would do outreach on how to conduct early literacy with their children, how to do a read aloud. For library staff, how to do a story time. So it is a big part of that volunteering piece.
Great. So we've talked about the pandemic a little bit, and your book was published in 2018. So thinking back, of what everyone's been through, what do you think the COVID-19 pandemic meant for international librarianship? And do you see that the shift, has the shift towards virtual work in the first year of the pandemic advanced international librarianship as a subfield at all?
Well, obviously the pandemic halted travel completely for a while, and after that it was limited. I was scheduled for a trip that was canceled, which is unfortunate because the group misses out on the in-person visit and the supplies that are brought. In terms of advancing international librarianship, if anything, we lost that time. And it also kind of has become a little bit of a deterrent in terms of volunteers for the future, because travel is just now starting to come back to a comfortable experience and something that people are willing to use their money to go and do. But we shifted as much as we could. We shifted to online ordering, as we mentioned before. And it's always the virtual work is always there, but it just increased because of the pandemic, and that has kind of stayed. We now see what we can do digitally and online, which before we might not have thought of, and then we might not have thought it would work, but the pandemic proved that it did, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I think our final question, just for this section, is just what are you working on now, or what would you like to be working on?
So post-COVID, I pivoted to focusing nationally in Canada. So I was president of our local association, and now I've moved on to our national Canadian Federation of Library Associations, which serves the associations in the country, and trying to give back that way as much as I can. Also, due to health reasons, I don't travel as much. The current costs of travel, the volatile political climate, and issues in certain countries in terms of war breaking out and things like that has made it very complex to travel in this sort of work currently. So a lot of what I still do in terms of international librarianship is virtual, is still keeping in contact with those teachers and staff, still handing them lesson plans, accepting their questions and answering them. So while I am grounded with the cost and the health right now, I'm keeping in contact and not removing my support so that when I do start to travel again, that relationship is still going. The work is needed now more than ever. If you do think of these political climate all around the world, librarians are being destroyed in war-torn areas. They're being restricted, bias is creeping in, book bans everywhere, not just where there are emerging libraries. So it is needed more than ever, I think. And anyone I can encourage to dip their toes in and investigate whether this is for you and check out some of the things in the book, I would encourage you to do that. I do have to mention a contributor to the book who is still physically building libraries in Africa. In chapter 7, Debbie Chavez, she submitted that chapter for us, and it has some fantastic advice on how to navigate from the ground up and how to deal with bias and things like that. So a shout out to her because she is still doing that great work, giving up her free time, fundraising, doing it all. And that chapter is one that's really important to me. So if you are interested, check it out.
That's great. And it's great to know that sort of that work and perspective on volunteering can really continue no matter where you are. And if you are traveling or not traveling, it's great to maintain those relationships with the folks that you've worked with.
Exactly. All right, that is it for me answering some questions. And now I can hear more about digital librarianship. So I do have a few questions for you, Anna. So I'll just start with what is digital librarianship and what did the pandemic mean for that area?
Right. So for me, I'm a librarian, at a large university, and digital librarianship for us. I also see like a few of my co-authors attending. They might want to drop in some comments in the chat. We're really focused on making unique primary resources accessible. So a lot of times that involves digitizing the materials that people will have in their special collections, such as photos, manuscripts, newspapers, and placing them online for anyone to use. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly had a big impact. In terms of our work, we actually had some somewhat beneficial outcomes. One of them was that people were working from home. We were able to get a ton of transcription projects done. So one project that we worked on, we had records of miners who immigrated to Utah from around 1900 to 1919. I think I want to say 80,000, it might be 40,000, I'm blanking on the number. But we were able to transcribe all of that. And now we have these records online that really demonstrate the diversity of people who are coming to work in the mining industry in Utah during that time. Another thing that the COVID-19 pandemic prompted was a turn towards born digital oral histories and doing oral histories with folks just on Zoom. And so we had undergraduate classes going out and collecting oral histories in this fashion and figuring out how to then put those materials in our digital library and making them accessible was another thing that we did during the pandemic as well.
I love that about oral histories. That must be super interesting. And I'm glad the pandemic had some positives for you. I've worked in school libraries, public libraries, and academic libraries libraries, so I'd love to get a better sense of how much of the info in your book is applicable to librarians who are outside of academia.
Right. We did a nationwide survey, and just to the due to the nature of like who's doing digital library work, a lot of the responses and information that we got were from folks in academic libraries, but we were really trying to cast a wide net. We had some case studies from folks that were doing collaborative projects, academic libraries and public librarians working together, as well as there are quite a few public libraries who also have digital collections of this type. And so we were also trying to feature their unique materials as well. So the bottom line is that everything that we're talking about pretty much is also openly accessible. So a lot of the resources that we're mentioning in the book can be used by anyone, no matter where you are.
Ah, good to know. Why do you think it's important to move beyond treating digital collections only as accessible, discoverable, or searchable, and instead make a mission of outreach and instruction?
Right. Well, I think for a lot of us, sometimes for folks that work in digital libraries, the idea is that, well, if you put it online and make it available, your job is done. And you don't really have to think about promotion because like people will find it. But that's not really the case. And doing this additional work to connect with folks in the community, work with classes, that can also provide benefits in terms of being able to bring in, more materials. We were also thinking of outreach and instruction, not just sort of within like you can do outreach like internally to your organization to even be like, hey, we have a great new collection. If you're meeting with a class, you should, remember to like let them know about it. And also to working with faculty, working with other folks in the community on both promoting the collections and then potentially sometimes getting, donations from the community to come in, like as well to build the collections to make them, represent the community as well.
Oh, wow. So, in your research, did you find international libraries and collaboratives were uniquely useful in modeling examples of outreach and instruction for digital library managers? And if yes, how so?
I mean, we were really focusing a bit on, the United States because all for our co-authors, that's where we are. But I think that anybody who's aware of developments in the digital library world really looks at Europeana as kind of an inspiration, both in terms of technical infrastructure, what they've been able to do to provide clear rights statements to folks in the digital library community. And then digital libraries, also have this tradition of working together and doing these large scale collaborative projects. And so for that, I keep in mind projects like the Digital Library of the Middle East or the Digital Library of the Caribbean. Those are also great places to go to see resources from a variety of institutions come together into one interface and just make that information accessible.
Great. And what are some examples of how best practices for digital library management promote equitable access to information?
I mean, I think one of the biggest things is, especially when you're dealing with primary sources and special collections materials, not everyone can travel and visit things in person. And especially, I mean, if you are dealing with rare materials, there is a disconnect between looking at a digital version of it and uh, the real thing. But in terms of just providing more access to more resources, it definitely, gives people the ability to do research in a way, that's not possible without that digitization, that metadata work, and allowing people to make connections between the special collections materials that are housed at different institutions can also be really wonderful in terms of opening up new possibilities for research.
All right, thanks. What do you think some key takeaways from your book might be for international librarianship practitioners?
I think, one thing it would be to just kind of check out some of the materials from places that you might be wanting to visit. And if you're visiting a library in another country, if you have a sense of, materials that they have, before you go, that can help with your research. And I think just in general, having a broad perspective on your work, the more that you're able to expose yourself to materials from different places, that's really beneficial.
That's great. And what is your dream vision of a digital library, or better yet, a digital and international library?
I mean, I think some digital libraries end up becoming more international than you might think, just due to the way that people collect materials. We have a collection of, I think, over 3,000 Arabic papyri in our digital library. And that's not something that you think of like Salt Lake City having, but we've got it and we've made it accessible to everyone. I think that having more interoperability and more open access, sometimes there's still collections that can't go online due to restrictions. Better copyright laws. I mean, if we're talking about like my dream, making it easier to put things online is what I would want.
Makes sense. That's all I had for you. I'll thank you for answering those questions, and I'll hand it back to Ramon.
Awesome. This was wonderful, just learning about new ways of working and as we were aiming for intersections between digital and international. We will now do the audience Q&A, and we do have a bunch of questions for each of you here in the Q&A function. Feel free to keep submitting as I go along. The first question is for Cate. It's from Jessica Twan, and it is, how do you address the question or problem of colonial influence when doing international librarianship work in developing nations?
Excellent question. And that's why I mentioned chapter 7 that Debbie wrote. She talks a lot about that, how we're not going in to save the day and impose our beliefs and our different library practices and things like that. We have to go in there to meet that library's needs on their turf, materials in their language, services they need. We are there as a support and a help. So we're very aware of that. And Debbie articulates it very well in chapter 7, the do's and don'ts. But thank you. That's a great question.
You answered this, or a good chunk of this during Anna's interview, but to follow up from Mallory Duff, does your book get into turning international librarianship as a career? If someone is interested in moving to another country and pursuing a job or finds a job that is outside of their current country, do you have advice or tips on that? Thank you. So this is the most ideal scenario where there is actually work, the person finds it, and what do they do once they actually find themselves in a position to pursue a career in international librarianship?
Yeah, you would follow up, you would network in the country that you're moving to, things like that. We solely a volunteer because we're not interested in being reimbursed.
Again, for Cate, speaking of bias, what did you and your co-author Dee Win do to maintain self-awareness around your own biases or cultural practices and then work to control for those?
Great question. You have to be very aware. You have to really think about what you're offering as a service or in terms of materials, even just where you are cataloging things. Um, so we're all very comfortable in our own home libraries and knowing where we might have some bias that we're trying to control, but going to a whole other country in another language and another situation, different political context, it's doubly so. You really, that is top of mind. And it's also, you are serving that library and those staff. So you have to really think before you respond and say, oh, no, no, you don't want to do that, or that doesn't work. You really have to be self-aware of what you're offering and how you're providing that support. So it is super important.
Interesting. A follow-up question that I have connected to that is, did you or Dee ever encounter any situations during your international library work where there were issues of intellectual freedom or information access and just what was legitimate or legal to provide in those spaces and navigating what was normal for you in Canada and stateside versus in other countries where there are different attitudes and policies and laws around information access?
We didn't run into anything legally. We did often get the request from teachers and library staff who have traveled themselves, who were aware that they needed and they wanted to promote pleasure reading. That's what we found a lot, as I mentioned, that there would be very few books that were encouraged for anyone to read, mostly the Bible in a lot of places. So while it wasn't illegal to read anything else, there was that hesitation. And if the staff and the teachers wanted us to do that as part of our programming, we would work with them on that. It wasn't, I don't recall anything legally, but we were making changes in terms of how communities interacted with the space and the staff versus traditionally what they would do if it was requested.
The next question is really good work for both of you and for anybody else in the high impact digital library team who is on the Zoom at the moment too. If I want to volunteer or otherwise work in Central America or Peru or Bolivia, can you suggest some organizations to reach out to?
I definitely can. Perhaps I could provide a list somewhere. We did mainly volunteer in Central America. I also was in Mexico, Roatan, Honduras, places like that. And there are lists in the back of the book too you can consult of resources and organizations. So it is provided in the book, but I'm happy to follow up with anyone who wants to contact through ALA.
Gotcha. And maybe in the chat or by email to me, you could submit and I will find some place to post that. The next question is there a forum or resource that lists libraries that have specific needs for international library volunteers? And I guess we could also ask Anna, is there a forum or resource that specifically references digital library work opportunities? Not really. But for Cate, you can answer that.
Did you say, is there a former one?
A forum, like an online
Oh,
forum.
an online forum? Not that I'm aware of.
I would say Michael Dowling at the ALA, who is overseeing our International Relations Committee and does a lot of work with different chapters and other groups domestically and abroad that are concerned with global work would be a good starting point, at least as far as ALA is concerned.
Yes.
Let's
You reminded me too, IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations, they have a lot of committees and interest groups, so you might want to check them out too.
And we do have quite a few people attending this program right now who were invited from IFWA. So if any of you want to provide further information in the chat, feel free to submit it there. Let's see, next question is from Maricris Reyes. How do you create or initiate a contact to where you want to go and help out?
So that's as simple as often it's the other way around. That you find through IFLA, your association, that they have reached out wanting help or wanting services. If you are going to a certain place, you can research the libraries or schools or hubs there if you think that they might be in need of help. That again can be all done online and just an email, just a very quick email to see if there's an opportunity, what you can do, what materials they need. So a lot of this work is done online with finding sources for books and all of that. But typically it's the other way around where you will see a call for help.
We're now going to go to questions for the digital team and Anna. From Lauren Conley. I think I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, close. How are digital materials maintained in order to ensure they're available in the future as new technologies evolve and others become obsolete?
So we didn't really talk about it so much in our book, but there's a whole field of digital preservation that we work with, and part of my group at the University of Utah. We do have a digital preservation team and a digital preservation system. Part of that is if we're scanning or reformatting materials, doing that to certain standards, our best guess of what we think will persist into the future, and also being aware of, formats and making sure that we're storing things in formats that we think are likely to persist.
Thing. And then also along those lines, looking at storage and classification. From another participant, the question is, would you suggest using a form of the Brian Deere classification system?
I think it very much depends on your materials, and if you are classifying, materials, that are coming more from an indigenous community, for sure. A lot of digital libraries by default use a Dublin core schema, which is, pretty flexible. And people are kind of limited to some extent with just what their repository system can do in terms of classification schemas. So that's always another consideration.
Another question for you, Anna. Can you share more about the strategies you use to make digital collections accessible, discoverable, and searchable?
Well, my main background is as a metadata librarian. So my response is going to be having good description, having that material described, will make it searchable and discoverable. But another thing is like, especially for digital libraries, um, people are coming in and finding our materials not necessarily by going to our digital library and like typing in our search bar. They're coming in through Google and random indexing, just through search engines. Another really important thing with digital libraries, and I touched on this a little bit when I was talking about Europeana, is participation in some of the regional and national hubs for digital libraries that are pulling this information and putting it in a shared index. So for us out west, we have the Mountain West Digital Library. It feeds our collections into the Digital Public Library of America. Being able to do that metadata exchange and provide information about our resources in a variety of digital libraries really then results in folks who might be totally unaware that, we have a digital library in Utah, but because they're searching these other digital libraries, they find references to these records, can navigate it and then be like, hey, I noticed you have this awesome photo. I would like to use it. So that I think is really key to making sure that things are discoverable.
Thank you. Another question for Cate. I love that you mentioned own language and international librarianship. What are some tips for less common languages that may have very limited material available in own language? And if you could talk a bit more about the own language concept.
For sure. When we volunteered in Guatemala, we were in the mountains in the high regions of Guatemala where everything's a different dialect, almost by community. So you do your best to communicate. There's a lot of pictures and hand gestures and things like that. But when they would often have their collection in Spanish anyways, but there's also the issue of places that can't even get materials, let alone in their own language. So in Honduras, we found that all their mail came from Florida and it often never made it. It was typically taken or something happened to it. So it's not just getting the materials in their own language, it's getting any materials. So in that case, often the library is a community hub. It's more about service, it's more about outreach, it's less so a collection and a circulation area. And those high regions in Guatemala too, it's such a culture shock. They make all their own food, they live in the open, no roof, things like that. So even for us, when we were planning programs with them and we had brought safety pins for whatever it was, we didn't realize they were prized possessions because they're making their own clothes. They need that. So you find things on the fly. Again, bias. We assume that a safety pin is a throwaway item, but find out it's very valuable. So even if it's not hard to find language, it's all kinds of other things too that you don't think about.
Interesting. So there's a lot of pivoting and reconsidering to be done once you actually get on the ground, and you've got to be prepared for that if you're going to do this kind of work in any capacity. I have one more question directed towards Anna, but also might be good for both of you to try to answer. It's from Jessica Twan. Uh, if I do not have a lot of or any experience doing digital librarianship, but would like to volunteer internationally to do this, are there free trainings or webinars available to help me brush up on skills that are necessary to help?
Yeah, real quick, I put some stuff in the chat because I thought that might be interesting if folks have sort of a similar question. The core group from ALA really has great resources, great webinars that you can attend. And also the Digital Library Federation, their groups are incredibly active. They have open meetings and often free training opportunities. So if you visit those links, you may be able to find some folks to connect with, and you can sign up for their emails when they might be having a webinar.
Right, I do see that in the chat, and I'll go ahead and copy that over so that anybody who wants that later can have it. One last question for each of you. Uh, uh, if you could make future projections for digital librarianship and international librarianship that would give our audience cause for optimism, what would at least one be? You can
I
take a
mean, I
moment.
think I'll go ahead. I mean, I think from the digital library side, like cause for optimism, I think whenever you're making something accessible, like that's like an act of hope. That's an act of optimism. So for me, whenever I see a new digital collection going online, I'm like, this is amazing. And that kind of just, keeping in with like the libraries, a librarian's core values of making information accessible to anyone. That's where I find my hope.
I would have to say it's how small the world has become. These distances can be traveled very quickly. Libraries are much more at the forefront as a community service, not just book lending. And as Anna mentioned, all the things we can do digitally and online has changed the world in terms of helping in other countries. And it's definitely many more positives than negatives. And I can only see this area growing and needs being met and us all moving forward.
Awesome, that's great to hear, and I completely agree. Well, thank you so much, Cate and Anna. This was wonderful. It's really helpful for everyone, I think. To our audience, if you enjoyed this discussion and don't have a copy of your Passport to International Librarianship or the High Impact Digital Library, you can visit alastore.ala.org to purchase either book or both. Meanwhile, please continue to join us this year for our many other free virtual programs. We have another one scheduled for February that I will share info with you about later, and many more to be announced through August of this year. Our book club meets at 1 p.m. Central every third Wednesday of the month. The next one will be Wednesday, February 19th, with several authors of the books Let's Talk About Race and Story Times, Libraries Without Borders, New Directions in Library History, and our February book club selection, Narratives of Disenfranchisement, Reckoning with the History of Libraries and the Black and African American Experience. Those three books will all be in conversation with one another for about an hour. You can visit aliaeditions.org/book club to register for that event on February 19th. Again, many thanks to everyone who participated in today's discussion, and I hope you all have a great rest of the week. Thanks all.